Dear viewers, thank you so much for tuning in to MMK Speaks, our very own interview series with some exceptionally exciting and illustriously high-profile individuals. If you haven't already, please show some love by subscribing to our channel and sharing this with colleagues and friends. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by Professor Iqbal Asaria, CBE, who will be talking about how we can achieve an ethical post-COVID economic recovery. Professor Asaria graduated with a bachelor's and master's in economics from the University of Manchester. He was awarded a CBE in 2005 for services to international development, and he currently serves as the Special Advisor on Economic Affairs to the Muslim Council of Britain's Secretary General. Now, with a second lockdown proving to be the nail in the coffin for many businesses and companies in the UK, a post-COVID economic recovery is currently looking bleak. Players in the aviation, retail, and hospitality sectors, who have been amongst the worst hit, may never operate at the levels they used to function pre-COVID. And with an unemployment rate at 4.5%, with this figure expected to grow to 9% by the middle of next year, the talk about our economy and how we will get out of this crisis is paramount to be held now more than ever. And so I'm keen to find out how the UK can achieve an ethical economic recovery. In order to do this, we'll be analysing the post-2009 financial crisis recovery. We'll be looking at the possible green economic recovery, and we'll also be assessing the implications that Brexit will have too. Welcome, Professor, to MMK Speaks. Now, before we kick off, I've heard that you used to have over 200 chickens in Kampala, Uganda, where you used to live as a child. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about that, please?
Thank you, Mehdi. Yes, this is part of our heritage. In Uganda, most of the houses used to have a flat roof. So we were encouraged by one of my uncles who was really very, very enterprising. He said, "Why don't you start keeping chickens on the roof?" So we created this huge shed, if you like, with wire mesh around it, and we brought 200-day-old chicks from Nairobi. At that time, Nairobi used to supply these specialty chicks. Breed was called Rhode Island Reds, which was reputed to be especially good at giving eggs at least once every other day. And he used to take us to the different restaurants, and we had to sell them. And so we started selling them, and so pay enough for getting the food for the chickens and so on. The only complaint from my mom was that invariably she was left with the broken eggs because those we couldn't sell. So we could only give it to her. I said, "I only left with broken eggs since you started this business."
Fantastic. Enterprising from a young age. So the first question then that I've got for you is, from the economic recovery following the 2009 financial crisis, what lessons have we learned in regards to what not to do following the current economic crisis?
2009 crisis was a watershed in the development of neoliberal market fundamentalist economics. They had thought before that, people like, if you remember, Professor Francis Fukuyama and others, had started to write books like End of History. I was saying, look, history has come to an end. We have learned everything we need to know about history. And now we can just concentrate on taking this prescription to the world by persuasion, if possible, by force, if necessary. And so we have discovered, if you like, the nirvana of economics. Markets will grow, taxes will be low, regulations will be as near to zero as possible, and everybody will be happy. In fact, 2009 revealed that this was all a smokescreen. It was based on a huge amount of debt, which was just hidden. So when Lehman Brothers collapsed and people started to analyze, they found that it was leveraged over 50 times of their equity base. Clearly, 50 times leverage, anything small goes wrong, you will go under. And that's exactly what happened. But what many people have not emphasized is that during that period, the balance between labor and capital had shifted. As Thomas Piketty shows in his groundbreaking book, 20th Century, yeah, he showed that normally the ratio of profits, if you like, or surplus flowing to labor used to be 60% and flowing to capital used to be 40%. Wherever in history this ratio was disturbed, then there were economic upheavals. During this time, before the 2009, the ratio had indeed shifted the other way. Labor was only getting 40% and capital was getting 60%. So it was building up. Now, that meant that ordinary people saw their wages stagnate in real terms. Nominal, see, there is a problem in economics that you have a nominal rate, which looks that you have the same salary. But if I give you the same salary for 20 years with an inflation rate of 5%, you are close to zero. So really, you have to look at real wage changes. So real wage rates had stagnated, especially for the public sector and the lower paid people. So how did they survive, those people? Everybody otherwise would have been 30, 40% worse off. And so we started a borrowing binge. I remember that when I came to study to the UK, we didn't know about credit cards or all kinds of other things. Today, I see some friends and some acquaintances who have no job and nothing. And I said, "What is your problem?" He said, "Sorry, I have run up credit card debts of £20,000. I said, "What? Who gave you £20,000?" He said, "Everybody was just offering credit cards and said, go and spend and spend and spend." So people were maintaining their living standards by using credit cards. And as you know, and you will know as a student very quickly, that sometimes credit cards max out. Your credit limit maxes out, and then you are stuck and you have to pay. So 2009 was a revealing moment that credit has maxed out. Those credits, which were then securitized and financially engineered at the back, were done by people like Lehman Brothers, which had now also maxed out. But the lesson we learned was not that the system was wrong. The lesson which the financial services sector wanted to sell to us was that this was a black swan moment, or in statistical terms, Sigma 6 moment. It's once in a millennium happening, which will not happen again. We can go back. Unfortunately, at that time, our government changed and the conservative government took over. Their lesson was even more perverse. They thought that we could even tax the poor more and bring a regime of austerity which will cut their real incomes by another 20%, instead of making sure that they were held up. And so we had these 10 years of austerity before the COVID pandemic stuck. Now, austerity, and this is why it is relevant to the COVID thing, in order to cut back, sometimes you try to cut things which are not noticed, which are under the radar, if you like. So, for example, you slowly reduce the frequency of rubbish collection, you slowly do this, you slowly do that, you do that. And generally, you remove all the resilience from the economy. So, for example, there was a very well defined department which was supposed to do modeling for exactly this kind of pandemics, unforeseen events. So you would have a certain amount of stocks of PPE, of this, of that, all kinds of things. especially after Ebola and things, we became aware that some diseases require quite a lot of resilience. What we found instead was that all this resilience had been taken away because the funding was slowly slipping away. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we were left with really unusable stocks of minimal PPE or this kind of stuff. And similarly, everywhere else, health system had been brought to the edge. There wasn't. So Germany had 5 times as many intensive care beds as we had per thousand population, for example. So we had cut back because when there is no emergency, you don't see those cutbacks. But as soon as the emergency came, we realized that this is going to overwhelm the NHS. And so we went to this Nightingale solutions and all kinds of things. But the fact was that austerity was allowed to cut back into all this. Unfortunately, the narrative has still not gone. The last budget from the Chancellor shows the same attitude. You want to freeze, even in nominal terms, the wages of the civil sector. And you want to still cut back, and you want to cut back on overseas aid and all kinds of things, which is, and you see, for example, a waste of 12 to 15 billion pounds on PPE contracts to cronies. This 12 to 15 would have cost 2 to 3 billion. So you see where this whole privatization, marketization mantra leads in terms of creating justice and equity in society. Those key workers who were instrumental in pulling us through the difficult phases of the pandemic in the last second quarter of this year are the very people we are saying, okay, your wages are now frozen. For how many years, God knows. And so the austerity comes in. This is only because we don't want to increase the taxation. If you don't want to increase the taxation, you cannot redistribute. And you come back to Piketty's main question, that until you redistribute, things will not go back to normal. But Piketty has a warning which is very interesting. Now, it's interesting that Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, when it was published, it became a bestseller. Now, this is a 600-page book on economics. For it to become a bestseller, it must have struck a chord with so many people, right? And you're looking at millions of copies sold. And but interestingly, after they took it, the establishment, but after a little while, now nobody mentions Piketty's name because the message is so clear and so vibrant. And Piketty says, unless we do something serious about this redistribution, every episode in history shows that it ends in a revolution. So if we want a peaceful transition, we need to be proactive. Otherwise, events will take their own course. And this is the problem. On top of that, we see in the pandemic something else, that we come across the first realization that we are not masters of the universe. We are dependent on so many other things. We are as strong as the weakest link in the whole global human chain. One person brings COVID, the whole world has to lock down. So we need to be careful to make sure that we look after and we try to participate in things which enhance the welfare of the whole world. That is the other lesson in equity. So obviously participation in things like WHO and others. But remember, with the cutback in aid, which is now looking to be of the order of 5 billion pounds per year, I would suspect it will last for at least 4 years to pay for the increase in the defense budget, which is exactly the same, 5 billion here out and 5 billion there in. We will start cutting back on our commitments to things like the WHO, the World Bank soft loan arm, bilateral aid, and all kinds of other things, apart from civil society aid. And so that will also weaken the whole global infrastructure. If countries like UK, we are supposed to be the fifth richest country in the world. If you're a fifth richest country in the world and you can't carry your own weight, the world is in a sorry state. Now, the other thing to note is that although you said that certain sectors like hospitality, travel, tourism will change, they will change, but how much we don't know. If there is a successful vaccine, there'll be a tendency to go back to normal. Now, this normal is a very dangerous word because if we go back to normal, we will still be perpetuating the inequity in our own society and in the global society. And then we have a problem. Let me give you an example of our mindset in the UK. The whole idea of Brexit came about during the time of Margaret Thatcher when she said, we can't be paying into the EU budget. You need a reduction in our payment to the EU budget. Why should we be subsidizing those Europeans, profligate Europeans, Southern Europeans who are enjoying themselves, etc., etc., etc. This was one of the most sinister ideas in our thinking. The whole idea behind EU was that if the richer countries contribute an amount which is then used to develop the less well-off EU countries, over time, the whole of the EU membership will have a similar standard of living. This will create a market which is huge. It will be 10 times what we have today because their spending power will be the same. This was exactly the logic which the Americans had used in launching the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. That if we finance the rebuilding of Europe and Japan, that will create a market for American goods, which will be many times more than what we put into it in the funding. This is what we call a visionary use of resources. Now, the Americans, as you know, are going back during Trump time saying, we don't want to fund this and we don't want to do that. We are saying, why should we be paying into the EU budget? Now we are saying, why should we be making overseas aid at all in trying to develop schools and hospitals and whatever in other countries? And sooner or later, it will come back to haunt us, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive answer. I guess the next natural point that I want to ask about is what are the challenges to achieving an environmentally sustainable economic recovery?
Now, obviously, if you think that the pandemic is difficult to handle, dangerous, the environmental challenge is many times more. Unfortunately, unlike the pandemic, this challenge unfolds very slowly and imperceptibly. So we had one of my Brazilian friends when we were working in the civil society movement on environment. He was the Minister of Environment for Brazil. He said, look, the question is like this. If you put a piece of paper on a table and you start to roll it towards the edge, and until you roll half, nothing happens. The paper stays steady. But as soon as a little bit more than half, it tips over the whole thing. And so he was saying that the rainforests are like that. When you start cutting and destroying, until you have destroyed quite a lot, nothing happens. But then suddenly there's a catastrophe. The whole thing collapses because the ecosystem cannot bear it anymore. So the environmental challenge is like that. Now, to give you an example, at that time when we were working with the World Bank NGO committee, the American attitude was interesting. The chief economist of the World Bank was saying to us, what is wrong in dumping toxic waste in underpopulated and underpolluted countries? We're paying them for it. We were saying, don't produce the pollutants. You don't want to you don't want to put those people into a mess as well. Thankfully, things have changed now. People are beginning to think, and we have the COP26 series of ideas to reduce carbon emissions. That's the only thing. But remember, if we are aiming to keep growth at 5 to 7% per annum globally, it is not the carbon, it is the resource use which is going to kill us. We have to find a way which takes our resource consumption down, which means growth will have to be rethought altogether. The definition of growth will not be how many things you possess. You, as a young man, you will know that every 2 years you can buy a new iPhone and a new iPod and this and that and all kinds of things, and you just throw away the old one. Look at the resource implication of this happening globally. How many things we are throwing, plastics, these, all kinds of things. Just last week, we saw in the newspapers that we were trying to dispose nuclear waste. You know, when the nuclear industry was privatized during Thatcher's time, they were quite proud to say that, look, the private capital has taken over, but they had left a clause that the disposal of nuclear waste will be for the government to take care of. And last week, the bill came in at 192 billion pounds and rising. So those guys had made money from the power stations, but had not taken the key liability of that kind of energy technology. All right. This way of shifting risk to the least, to the people who can most afford it, mainly the taxpayer, which is what the financial system did in the 2009 as well. $4.5 trillion of subsidies we gave to them, is not going to change the growth pattern, and it's not going to change the environmental crisis. In fact, if you look at the kind of resources, commodities, the metals used in electric batteries and electric cars, for example, is even worse than those used in fossil fuels. So it's not just rethinking how to stop carbon emission, making everything electric. It's how to reduce the number of cars, the number of car journeys, how to change this pattern. And that's why when you talk about travel sector, we know that about 5% or maybe maximum 10% of the travelers use 70% of the aircraft pollution create. So this 10%, which is where everywhere you will go, the 10% is benefiting at the expense of the 90%. The behavior of this 10% will have to change. If the environmental crisis, we need to understand it properly. The second thing about the environmental crisis is that what we used to call in our days at the NGO space was the historic call on global ecological capital. We can see that the developed countries have used more than their fair share of the global ecological capital. So now to say to the other countries that you stay in your jungles while we continue to enjoy is not going to go down well. So we have to say, okay, we have had more than our fair share, so we will have to contribute more than our fair share in solving these problems, which could be in the form of removing patent rights to technologies, which is where most of the service revenues come in. But if we start imposing very heavy patent rights or royalties, then those people cannot afford it. Now, as you have seen, for example, with the COVID vaccine, the two vaccines which have been developed by private companies, although subsidized by the state, they're talking about $25 to $35 per vaccine. You multiply that by a billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, and you see the amounts which is required for that purpose. The Oxford vaccine is cheaper, which is $5, but again, they will be slapped with patents on top. And so for years to come, people will be paying these people, although their development was funded by governments and taxpayers. And so we need to rethink the whole thing and see that, first of all, resource use is the criteria, not carbon use, resource use overall, how much copper, how much cobalt. Now the new technologies all will require cobalt and silicon and so on. And although it is very much under the radar, you see that all the upheavals in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, so called, are because of the abundance of certain uh, commodities there, like cobalt and lithium and so on. And all the fighting is because of that. Now, that will be another colonial, if you like, type movement to colonize those countries. And the biggest producer of these things at the moment is China. If these things become critical to the whole chain of technology, China will have a natural advantage because it has local resources on this. All these things will need to be thought through, and people globally will need to see how to cooperate with each other. So, to move away from international institutions, international fora, international discussions is going to be not productive at all. I'm glad that at least temporarily that Trump has gone and the Americans will again begin to think globally, if not act globally. But it has to be made into a lasting arrangement. And when it now comes to giving up your disproportionate use of global ecological capital, you can see the kind of huge challenges emerging. How do you persuade an American to say, okay, you have to lower your central heating by 5 degrees? You can't be just using it at 25. You have to come down to 20 and manage your housing. And all these gun lobbies will say, this is our freedom, we cannot give it up, and so on. And you can see what is going to happen. This requires a great amount of statesmanship. Otherwise, as Piketty says, okay, you wait for a revolution and it will take its own course. It will not solve anything. It will destroy everything which is there, and then we wait for what comes out of it.
I particularly like the analogy at the beginning about the piece of paper. But again, a really good summary of the problems we have and some of the challenges we might face in adopting a greener economic future. I guess the last question is then, with our departure from the EU happening on the 31st of December this year and with no deal in sight yet, in your opinion, how will our departure from the EU impact our economic recovery, especially if we do exit on no deal terms?
Okay, at the moment, the best projection from the budget Budget Responsibility Office, I think it's called, is something like a 3 to 4% downturn from COVID, which will not be, if there is a vaccine, it will not be a permanent downturn because some of it will be recovered, but a more permanent 5% downturn from Brexit, or thin Brexit or no deal Brexit or whatever it is, right? 5% of GDP, you are grumbling about 0.7% of GDP for overseas aid. So you can see what 5% of GDP is. I suspect that when we get out and the implications become clear and all our fumbling and jumping around and theorizing about becoming the Singapore of Europe come to naught, we will have to find a way back into Europe. This may take 10 years or 20 years. We will have to find a way back. Let me give you one scenario which has always worried me. At the moment, as you know, the United Nations Security Council has got 5 members who have a right of veto. So China, Russia, the United States, France, and UK. They have a veto on the Security Council. There has been discussion that why does Europe need 2 veto rights? Europe is only 500 million. India is 1 billion plus. South America, Africa have no power on the veto rights yet. So a loose UK island with no real value add, the first question will come is that if you want to allocate a seat to India or to Latin America or to Africa, the UK's right should be gone. What is the point? Europe has got one right. And all these Brexiteers and Churchillians and so on, yeah, will have to explain to the people that now we have even lost that fig leaf of power which we had at the United Nations. And I'm telling you, if the Brexit is muddy, Europeans are going to instigate that discussion at the UN. And to a logical discussion, you can always say India has 1 billion and has no say. And India can come back and say, yeah, we have no say. So it'll be a moment very much like the moment where this Indian author Ashish Nandi, in his book Tower of Cricket, he says that the day India won the World Cup in cricket, England had a psychological breakdown. How can a subject people defeat us at cricket, which is our top game of our elites? And the same thing is going to happen the day India wins the Security Council seat and pushes the UK out. There'll be another breakdown and a milestone. So I expect very, I think, quite clearly that we will need to find a way, however we, call it or disguise it, into Europe and European circles.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this interview. I was absolutely blown over by the depth of discussion that we had. It was a thought-provoking set of answers that you gave as well. So thank you so much for your time.
So we want to leave this now for your generation, maybe, to take forward, but really learning from the lessons of the past and seeing how we could go forward in a world which requires more cooperation. You can't be selfish. You have to be, you know, uh, globally cooperative, ethical, fair, and try to see if we can grow the world as well. When they grow, we grow because our trade opportunities and everything else grows. When they don't grow, we don't grow, and then everybody starts fighting. So really, it's your generation. We hope that in the next 20, 30, 40 years of life, active life, which you people have, you can bring these whole strands together, inshallah.
Thank you so much for those closing couplets. For more information on MMK Public Speaking, please visit our website, mmkareem.com. But until next time, have fun, stay well, and stay safe.